Welcome to Samurai Gaiden, the educational web series where I, Richard Shaffer, talk about the stories and anecdotes of the men and women of Sengoku Japan and the events that shaped their lives. We spoke a few months ago about Minamoto no Yorimasa, the man who joined with the Midera warrior monks and Go Shirakawa's son, and were eventually defeated at the Battle of Uji River. But while we delved into Yorimasa's performance of seppuku at the battle's end, we only briefly touched on the other events of the day. We had centered the discussion on Yorimasa because we were talking about seppuku. But now that we have that thinly veiled topic off our minds, why don't we take a look at the arguably more impressive and interesting feats of the other warriors present on that warm June day in 1180. If you don't remember anything about Minamoto no Yorimasa, he, along with the emperor's son, raised a rebellion against the lord of the Taira clan, Taira no Kiyomori. The rebellion didn't go well though, and Kiyomori sent two of his sons, Tomomori and Shigehira, to quash the short-lived rebellion. We already talked about how the monks of Midera Temple broke up the bridge so that only a narrow beam could be crossed. Now, we already discussed the suicidal end of Minamoto no Yorimasa and his sons, so we won't bother going into too much detail on that. Instead, there are 5 other people to discuss today. The first is the monk Tajima. No, wait, there's kind of a funny story we have to touch on first. Then I'll get to Tajima. So I just said the monks and the Minamoto soldiers tore up the bridge, right? Well, the Taira forces arrived at the river just before dawn. As the sun rose, a thick fog was wafting across the river, to the point that neither side could really see the other side of the river. The Taira forces shouted a mighty war cry, and the badly outnumbered Minamoto forces and Midera alliance countered with their own war cry. The Taira vanguard of cavalry rode valiantly onto the bridge, charging with reckless abandon, where they fell to their deaths through the hole in the bridge. Deciding that had been a bad idea, Taira formed up on the north side of the river, and they began trading arrows with the Minamoto on the south side of the river. And now we get to Priest Tajima, after the sun rises and the battle is raging. So Tajima is a Sohei, a warrior monk of the Midera Temple. As the Taira forces were trying to cross the bridge, he threw the sheath off his naginata and leapt onto the narrow beam to impede them. The Taira soldiers aimed at him and fired their arrows at the brash monk. Luckily for Tajima, he was adept at the Patches O'Houlihan's school of dodge arrow, because he was able to dodge, dip, duck, dive, and slice the arrows out of the air. The ones aimed right at him, he spun his naginata around, knocked them out of the air. The ones aimed too low to slice, he jumped over them. The ones aimed too high to slice, he simply ducked to avoid them. After fighting to exhaustion, he returned to his own lines, but his efforts earned him the moniker Gouchiin no Tajima, Tajima, the arrow cutter. The next up was the fierce warrior, Tsutsui Jomyo Meishu. Jomyo took a position on the beam of the bridge and knocked an arrow to his bow. He fired 24 arrows at the Taira forces trying to cross the bridge. With 1 arrow left in his quiver, there were 12 dead and 11 more wounded on the Taira side. Though he had 1 arrow remaining, for reasons unbeknownst to us, he threw his bow into the water, then his quiver. He picked up his naginata, kicked his sandals into the water, and calmly walked toward the Taira side of the river, barefoot. He cut down the first man who came within reach of his naginata. Then another, and another. After killing 5 men with ease, he swung his naginata so hard against the body of a 6th Taira warrior that he broke the polearm. He drew his sword and engaged in even more fighting, and cuts down not 1, not 3, not 6, but 8 men with his sword. He then swung the sword around to kill a 9th, and caught the man on his helmet, shattering the blade at the hilt. He paused comically to regard the blade as it fell through the hole in the bridge and splashed into the water. Jomyo began withdrawing back across the bridge, wielding only his dagger as the Taira gave chase. He furiously fought back against the Taira, cutting men and throwing them into the river when they neared him. But it was at this moment, when a man came up behind him and grabbed him by the collar of his armor. That man pulled down hard, knocking Jomyo to the beam. And that man was Ichirai Hoshi, another monk of Midera, who was upset that Jomyo was too big and the bridge's beam was too narrow to fight side by side with his colleague. Ichirai wanted his chance for glory too, so he leapt over Jomyo's body and began a vicious swath of death against the Taira, who dared to cross the bridge. Jomyo stood up and collected himself, retiring to the Minamoto side of the bridge. When all was said and done, he had no less than 63 arrows sticking out of his armor. It is said that Jomyo looked like a hedgehog. Nonetheless, Ichirai fought valiantly against the innumerable Taira. He fought for some time before he became wounded, and eventually he fought until he could no longer fight and fell upon the bridge's beam, having killed several Taira warriors, and kept them at bay for a rather long time. Now, as I had said in Yorimasa's video, the Taira commanders were considering taking a different route, 50 miles out of their way, just to avoid the fighting at Uji Bridge. But one amongst them scorned the idea. His name was Ashikaga Tadatsuna, and he was just an 18-year-old man of the Fujiwara branch clan. And so now would be a good time to mention that he was of absolutely no relation to the Ashikaga family, who would eventually become shogun. The Ashikaga clan that people like Ashikaga Yoshiteru and Ashikaga Yoshiaki came from was a branch family of the Minamoto. They were named after the city they ruled from, originally Ashikaga. The group became shogun during the Muromachi period. This particular family of Ashikaga also took their name from the same city of Ashikaga, but they were descended from the Fujiwara. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get back to the brash warrior Tadatsuna. You see, Tadatsuna had a force of 300 warriors from the Ashikaga clan at his beck and call, and he was tired of being unable to see any action. He advised trying to ford the river, and just to prove how good of an idea it was, he'd lead the way. He called up his Ashikaga warriors and gave them a quick bit of advice. Join hands and go across in a line. If your horse's head gets pulled underwater, lift it up out. If the enemy fires at you, do not draw your bow to return fire. Keep your head down and use your helmet and neck guard at a slope to protect you. But don't slope your neck guard too far, or you'll open the vulnerable top of your helmet to the enemy. Tadatsuna then led his forces in a fierce war cry, and they dredged across the river. Tadatsuna at the lead. His horse's feet were still in the water when he stood high in the saddle and announced himself, as was the custom. I am Ashikaga no Tadatsuna of Shimotsuke, 10th generation descendant of Tawara Toda Hidesato, the renowned warrior. With that formality out of the way, he led his Ashikaga cavalrymen up the riverbank and into the Minamoto forces. The Taira commanders, ashamed at this brash upstart success, sent their own men fording across the river, and the Minamoto position was overwhelmed. Of Tadatsuna, it is said there will be no warrior like Ashikaga no Tadatsuna in ages to come. Said to have been as strong as 100 men, with a voice that could be heard 25 miles away, and almost inch-long teeth. And we already talked about how Yorimasa and his sons fought to the death, at least 2/3 of which was by their own hand, so I guess there really aren't any more important people to talk about. Is there? Oh, right, I did forget to mention what happened to Prince Mochihito, because he totally escaped the battle and made it part way to Nara. But he paused briefly to rest at a Shinto shrine, and the Taira did not pause in their pursuit of him. When the prince tried to flee the shrine, the Taira simply loosed their arrows at him. And there's a reason why Prince Mochihito is not known as Mochihito the Arrow Cutter. He was Mochihito the Pincushion by the time the Taira were done with him. I suppose we can also mention what came of those allies from Nara. You see, the reason Yorimasa and Mochihito were headed south was because they had also secured the support of thousands of warrior monks from the temple complexes of Kofukiji and Todaiji. Unfortunately for them, by the time they had mobilized to aid the Midero monks and the Minamoto, Yorimasa's head was at the bottom of the Uji River, Mochihito was a pincushion on the roadside, and the Taira held the most important roads and bridges into Kyoto. Kiyomori was not one to forgive such ideas, and he sent one of his veteran sons of Uji, Taira no Tomomori, to Midera a few months later. The monks realized that regardless of how many of them had joined the Minamoto, they were all on the receiving end of his punishment. They barricaded the temple complex and prepared to hold out against Tomomori's siege and his 10,000-man army. Spoiler alert, Tomomori's army ripped through the barricades and burnt the complex to the ground. Now it was just a matter of what to do about the monks of Nara. Kiyomori was interested in sparing them, because they hadn't actually fought him, and he didn't want to create a Buddhist revolution, which could be very dangerous. But he still had to punish them, unless their high priest would agree to support the Taira clan. Unfortunately, the Sohei were in charge by now, and the more pacifist monks, referred to as Gakusho, weren't able to corral them into switching sides. As a matter of fact, Kiyomori's messenger was attacked, and his head was shaved, a grave insult to a samurai, and he was sent back to Kyoto, after a good thrashing. They then commissioned a wooden bust of Kiyomori's head, which they would entertain themselves with by kicking about the courtyard of the temple. Even so, Kiyomori sent a mere force of 500 men to admonish them. 500 was not enough, and the monks captured almost a fifth of them, executing them by beheading, and then paraded the severed heads around the temples and the nearby countryside. Kiyomori decided enough was enough, and he sent one of his other sons, the other veteran of the Battle of Uji, Taira no Shigehira. Now, Shigehira was by no means Kiyomori's favorite. He was said to have been Kiyomori's ugliest son and was prone to fits of rage and rancor, which annoyed Kiyomori. That may have been why Kiyomori sent Shigehira, because at the announcement that Taira no Shigehira was approaching the Nara temple complexes with a sizable Taira army, the monks decided this time it was serious business. Sohei and Gakusho alike, numbering 7,000, fortified the Kofukiji and Todaiji temples. Shigehira's samurai cavalry were unable to penetrate the moats and walls built around the temple, or the hail of arrows the warrior monks pelted them with. They were led by a mighty Sohei named Yogaku, a man so massive he was said to wear 2 suits of armor, at a time, one under the other. By nightfall, Shigehira decided to try a new tactic, one we've already mentioned with the Hogan disturbance. Burn them out. He set some of the buildings outside the complex ablaze, and after some time of worrying the breeze might bring the fire back to his camp, the wind changed direction. The fire crept into the temple complex, setting the storehouse on fire. Then a pagoda, then the bell tower, and before long, the entire temple complex was ablaze. The civilians within the temple complex, the aged, infirm, women, and children, had rushed into the higher floors of the Daibutsuden, the Great Hall of Buddha within Todaiji's complex. They hauled up the ladder so the Taira forces wouldn't be able to climb up to them if the monks defending the complex failed. Unfortunately, the Daibutsuden was one of the first buildings to catch fire. Contemporary sources state that the screams were so bad, they claimed it was worse than the screaming one would expect from the hottest fires of the 8 hot layers of hell. In total, 3,500 people died in the fires, and another 1,000 warrior monks died in the fighting. The 1,000 heads taken were either displayed at the gate of the fallen temples or taken back to Kyoto to be paraded around by the victorious Taira forces. For months, people in the Nara area were unable to find priests to perform religious services because so many of them had died at Kofukiji and Todaiji. So that's a little more on the Battle of Uji. Now, I promise next month we'll go back to something Sengoku. We're getting to the point where the Heian stuff starts to outnumber the Sengoku. Can't have that now, can we?